else join me? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Wow, I'm going to check this out. Oh, this is complicated. All right, well, I will check that out later. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That's very kind of you. And thank you for that extremely kind introduction. None of that was true. It's a pleasure to be here again, see many old friends, make some new ones. It's a couple of years since I was last here, but it's always great fun to visit and talk with people. So I'm going to talk about networks today. I'm going to talk about some stuff we've been doing on large-scale structure in networks. So I think I don't need to tell this audience what networks are and why they're interesting. I assume that you know this already. But very briefly, when I talk about the network, I mean a bunch of dots joined together by lines. And we're interested in them because they can represent all sorts of complex systems that are of interest to us in science and engineering and the social sciences. Things like the internet, a network of computers with data connections between them, the World Wide Web, a network of web pages joined together by hyperlinks, ecological networks like this food web, where the nodes are species and the links connecting them together are some kind of ecological interactions between species. Biochemical networks like this metabolic network, where the nodes are metabolites, chemicals in the cell, and the interactions connecting them together are chemical reactions that turn one metabolite into another. Or social networks like this one, which comes from my own work on scientific collaboration. In this picture, the nodes represent scientists, and the edges, the connections between them, are which scientists have collaborated with which other ones. Or this one here from Valdis Krebs' work, which is a network of from a study he did on the spread of tuberculosis. So it's a network of who's been in close proximity with whom, the network over which an infectious disease spreads. So you look at a picture like this, and it's pretty easy just to eyeball it and see what the structure of the network is. In this case, there's obviously some interesting stuff going on here. There's like these hubs in the network, and there's these longer range connections. And we have a bunch of examples here where you can just look at these pictures and you can see what's going on. Well, that's nice, but that's rare. Most of the networks that we look at these days are too large and too complicated for us to really understand what the structure of the thing is just by eyeballing them. This web example is an example of that. There's stuff going on here, but you'd be hard pressed to say what the exact structure of this network is, because it's just too dense and too complicated to make a reasonable picture of it on the screen here. And this is only a tiny fraction of the World Wide Web, right? The World Wide Web has billions of vertices in it, billions of nodes, billions of connections, and there's no way you could make a picture of it in any reasonable sense and understand what its structure is. So then you turn to mathematical methods to make sense of what the large-scale structure of these networks is, and that's a lot of what we do. So there's been plenty of work on networks which is looking at individual properties of nodes and the way one node is connected to another node and stuff, local stuff in the network. But what we're looking at is the large-scale structure. We want to know the big picture. How does this network break down into different pieces, and how are they related to each other, and what's the big picture? If I had to describe this whole network to you in a few sentences, how would I do it? That's what we're trying to get at. We're trying to get at what does the network look like when we can't actually look at it, because it's far too big and complicated for us to eyeball it. So I want to give you a few examples of things we can do to get at those kinds of questions today. And one of the sort of take-home messages is going to be that there isn't one answer to this question. Some people would like you to believe that they've come up with the magic method for analyzing network data, and it's going to tell you everything you want to know. And I just don't believe that that's true. I think that there are many different ways of looking at this, and that different ones may be appropriate for different systems. And the approach should always be that I have a scientific question that I want to answer, And then I should think, what method of analysis is going to answer the question that I'm interested in? I'm not interested in coming up with a hammer and then looking for nails. I'm interested in finding nails that interest me and then coming up with the appropriate hammer. So here's an example to get us started. This is from some work that I did a few years back with Aaron Clausette, who was then a graduate student working with Chris Moore, who's now at the Santa Fe Institute. And we were looking at hierarchical structure in network. I've actually talked about this project before, the last time I was here a couple of years ago, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today. I want to have time to get onto the new stuff that we've been doing. But this is a nice example just to sort of get things started and show you the kind of things that I'm thinking about. So the idea here was that we were interested in this hierarchical structure in networks. So one possible way that networks could be structured, and this is not the only one, that's kind of part of the point here, but one possible way that networks could be structured is that they could be broken up into clumps like this, and then the clumps could be broken up into smaller clumps and smaller ones and so forth. So I've got the blue clump, the red clump, and the green clump, but then there's various different reds and various different greens and so forth. There's structure within structure within structure here. And this is what we call hierarchical structure. In networks, there's structure on the largest scales, and there's structure on smaller scales, and there's structure on the smaller scales. All the way down to the scale, in principle, of a single node. So how could we represent this mathematically in a network? Well, there's probably various ways of doing it, but the way that we hit upon was to represent a structure like this using a tree. So here is a tree in the sort of computer science sense of something which sort of breaks up and then breaks apart and breaks apart and breaks apart again until we get down to the lowest levels. For some reason, when computer scientists draw trees, they put the individual nodes at the bottom here, what they call the leaves, and this at the top is what you call the root of the tree. That's kind of the other way up from the way we're used to trees being. Usually they have the roots at the bottom and the branches at the top. But computer scientists tend to draw them this way around. Upside down. So these are the leaves, this is the root, and the idea here is that the root sort of represents the biggest scales of structure in the network, and the leaves represent the smaller scales of structure, and these are the individual nodes at the bottom. And I imagine, well, what do I imagine this really meaning? So people have been drawing things like this to represent networks for quite a long time. We're not the first people to do this by any means. The sociologists were doing this kind of stuff in the 70s. But the thing was, they kind of never exactly said what it is that the tree means. So usually when people draw trees like this, it's the output of some computer program. I have some computer program that somehow breaks this network apart, and its output is a tree representing some kind of structure like this. But what does the tree actually mean? They never really say that. But if you sort of read between the lines, if I had to guess what they think the tree means, it's that two nodes that are sort of connected lower down in the tree, like this one and this one, are more likely to be connected than two nodes where you have to go all the way up and back down again to connect them together. Right? So if you're very close together in the tree, you're more likely to be connected. And if you're on completely different branches of the tree, then you're less likely to be connected. So in other words, there's this tree, and then it implies the network, right? Give me this tree, it implies a network in that there's high probability of connections here between nodes that are close together over here, and low probability of connections between nodes that are far apart over here. Okay, so you get the idea. If I give you the tree, you can get the network. Trouble is, that's not what we actually have in the real world. What we have in the real world is you give me the network and I don't know the tree. So I want to do an inverse problem here. I want to go in this direction and get the hierarchical structure from the network, not the other way around. Right? So it would be easy to go from here to here. It's hard to go from here to here. And that's the whole trick here. So how do we do it? Well, the hand-wavy way of saying how do we do it is, well, okay, if we know how to go from here to here, I can take a tree and I can generate a network. Let me just take a whole bunch of different trees, different shapes with the tree arranged in different ways. and generate networks from them. And then I see which network, I do that, you know, a million times on my computer or something like that, and then I see which network I get looks most like the real network in the real world, and then I go back and I see which tree generated that one. Right? And that's the tree that's in some sense the best fit to the network that I observed in the real world. Well, that's the hand-wavy way of describing it. In detail, there's a bit more math to it than that. We do it using a maximum likelihood method. What we actually do is we calculate the probability that this network was generated by that tree, and then we maximize that probability over all trees, which we do using a Monte Carlo method. But the bottom line is I can search through a large set of trees and find the one that's most likely to have produced the network that I actually see in the real world. So, for some cases, this turns out to be a pretty good way of understanding what the structure of the network is. The end product is a tree. You give me a network, and I get a tree, and the tree somehow represents this hierarchical decomposition of the network, starting with the whole network, breaking it into groups, and then breaking those groups into groups, and those into groups, and smaller until you get down to the level of the individual network. So in one structure, it represents decomposition of this network on all different scales, big scales, little scales, large groups, small groups within groups, and so forth. So one thing you can do with this is you can just take a network and you can generate a tree from it. Right? That tree in itself may be a useful output. You can just look at that and understand something about the network. However, this is not a very good way of representing the structure of a network. It's not terribly human readable. A better way is to take the same thing and sort of superimpose it on top of the network itself. So here's an example. These two things are actually the same network. So this is a real network. It's a network of, so it's an ecological network. It's a network of host-parasite interactions. So some of the nodes represent host organisms, and some of them represent parasites that live on those organisms. And some of them represent hyperparasites that live on the parasites. And there are even some hyperparasites that live on the hyperparasites. So this is the, you know, little fleas have smaller fleas upon their backs that bite them kind of thing, right? It's that network. So what I've done here is I've just put boxes that represent the levels of division in the tree. So there's sort of the whole network, and then it's divided up into some large boxes like this one and this big one over here. And then within those, there are some smaller divisions and so forth. Right? So I've just taken the structure that was inherent in the tree and superimposed it on a picture of the network. And it turns out that it does some interesting things. For instance, look at these groups over here. What this is, so this is some organism that has a parasite, the purple box, living on the blue triangle. And then this parasite has some hyperparasites living on it, the upside down yellow triangles here. So it's put a box around the blue square and the yellow triangles because it's worked out that they're all sort of part of a group somehow. They're part of the structure of the network. They go together. But here's the interesting thing. It's also put a smaller box that just goes around the parasites. Right? So it's worked out, even though those parasites are not connected to each other directly, they're only connected to the same host, it's worked out that they have something in common and it's grouped them all together. And it's done that separately from the grouping of all of these with the purple box. So it's worked out that both of those are meaningful things. It's a meaningful thing to take an organism and its parasites and make a group of them, but it's also a meaningful thing just to take the parasites on their own and make a group of them. Right? Both of those are sort of biologically useful descriptions of what's going on in this network. Here's some other things you can do once you have stuff like this. So a very neat trick you can do is something called generalization, which is, so I've found a tree that corresponds well to the hierarchical structure of this network. Once I have that tree, as I've said, you can generate a network from it. You can throw down edges between nodes with higher probability when things are close together in the tree and lower probability when they're further apart in the tree. If I do that twice, I won't necessarily get the same network both times because there's randomness inherent in that process. I'm throwing down random edges. So I can take that tree and I can generate 1,000 different networks from it. And they'll all have the same sort of hierarchical structure in them, but they'll actually be different networks. Right? So what it allows me to do is take a single network that I observe in nature, and from it I can generate a whole set of networks, 1,000 others, that are like the network I started with, but they're not the exact same network. So this could be a very useful trick if I want to test something, test some approach to something. I can take a network or even a small sample of a network, and I can use it to generate another network that's like that one, or even a larger network that's like that one. So, suppose you're interested in testing a new protocol on the internet or something like that. You want to do this in simulation. You don't want to test it on the real internet, so you want to generate a network that is like the internet. So you use techniques like this to generate networks that are statistically like a network that you see in the real world, but they're not exactly the same network, right? Actually, that's a very popular occupation amongst people who do internet engineering. They use so-called topology generators to generate fake networks that are like the real internet so they can run simulations on those. If you take all of those networks, so you generate this large bunch of fake networks that are like the one you started with, you can measure their properties like degree distributions and distance between nodes and so forth, and it turns out that those agree pretty well with the ones that you see on the original network. So that's what these two plots are showing here. The blue line is the actual degree distribution of the network we started with, and the red is the average over many of these resampled networks that are like the original one. So it turns out that not only in the sense of hierarchical structure, but also in the sense, for instance, of degree distribution or distribution of distances in the network, these similar networks are capturing the features of the network we started off with. So that's a hopeful thing. Apparently, if you get the hierarchy right, you also get a bunch of other things right as well. Another cool thing you can do with stuff like this is I can take a look through all of these networks. So I've generated 1,000 networks which are allegedly like the network I started off with, and I can look through them all and I say, that's interesting. In 90% of these networks, I see that there's an edge between person A and person B, or between node A and node B in this network. And yet there was no such edge in the original network I started with. Right? So I can look for that kind of situation. I can look for edges that commonly occur in this large group of networks, but were not there in my original data set. And I say, well, that's a suspicious case, right? That's an anomaly. That's an edge that I would have expected to be there based just on the hierarchical structure of the network, but which I don't actually see in my data. So you can use this for various things. You can use it just to identify anomalous edges in the network, but you can also use it for link prediction, which is, I think my data is incomplete. I think the network I measured is a pretty good measurement, but there's probably some mistakes in there. There's some errors, there's some edges missing, there's some things that were measured wrong. If I believe that, then I could say, can I predict which edges are missing from my network? Right? Well, the way I would do that is I'd go through looking for these edges that appear with high likelihood in the resample group, but don't appear in the original network. And I predict, I think that's going to be an edge that should have been there, but wasn't. So you can use this kind of underlying structure, this hierarchical structure, to predict missing edges in your data set. You can also do the reverse thing. I can go through and I can look for edges that are not there or are very rarely there in this large set of 1,000 resampled networks, but which were there in the original data set. That's also an anomaly. I didn't expect this edge to be here, but it is here. Okay, there's something strange going on with that. Maybe that edge was a mistake. Maybe that was a false positive. When I measured the structure of my network, I measured there to be an edge there, but it shouldn't really be there. Right, that was a mistake. So I can identify false negatives and I can identify false positives. I can't do this with 100% probability. Right? It doesn't work all the time, but I can do it with success a lot better than chance. So it turns out that this method works pretty well. What you can do is you can do a so-called cross-validation test. You take a network and you remove a bunch of the edges. You just artificially remove a bunch of edges, and then you feed it into this analysis, and you see if you can predict which edges you removed. Right? You know which ones are missing because you took them out. See if you can work that out by doing this analysis. And it turns out you can do pretty well. So this plot here is an analysis of a particular ecological network. It's basically showing, as a function, horizontal axis, what fraction of edges are observed in the network. So down here, I didn't observe any networks. I give you nothing at all. Well, in that case, you're not going to be doing any good doing a prediction of where the missing edges are, because all of them are missing. Over here, I give you the whole network. Right? In the middle, I've removed some of the edges. Right? And the question is, how well do I do predicting those edges? What this quantity on the vertical axis is, it's sort of how much better than chance I do at predicting where the edges are. So the stupidest thing I could do is I can just guess at random which edges are missing. Right? Right? So the question is, can I do better than that? And that's what this is measuring. If I'm doing no better than random, this quantity here gives me a 0.5, it gives me a 50%. So I'm looking at how much better I do than 50%. These curves with the dotted lines down here are all very sort of simple toy ways of predicting missing edges. Things like, I'm going to look for two nodes that have a common friend, and I'm going to predict that they're connected. Right? So they're very simple, rudimentary methods of doing it. The one at the top, the method that does best, is the method that I just told you about using this hierarchical structure. So you can do a lot of different things with this kind of stuff. So the bottom line here is that you guess some kind of structure that you think is present in your network. In this case, it was this hierarchical structure. And then you fit that structure to the network data that you have. And then you hope that that fit tells you something about your network. So you can think of this in the same sense as if I had a bunch of dots on a graph. You know, I measured these dots. I got some scatter of dots around here. I fit a straight line through them. And fitting that line tells me something about my data, right? It allows me to estimate the slope and the intercept. You know, like this is something people do all the time. They fit lines through data, right? And it tells you something useful. Okay. But then what if the data I had were a bunch of points and they actually looked like this? Here's my points, right? There's some. Now I try and fit a straight line through them, and you know I can do that. I can put a line here or here or here or something. I can fit a straight line through it, but none of them is a good fit. Right? So it's possible to try and fit something to your data, and you can just blindly go ahead and do the fit. And there is a best fit in some sense, but even the best fit isn't telling you anything useful. Even the best fit is a very bad fit because the data just aren't a straight line. You just can't fit a straight line to something that's inherently curved. So the catch here is that you're guessing some kind of structure, in this case this hierarchical structure, that you're fitting to your data, and it's only going to work if there is a good fit. Right? There's absolutely no guarantee that even the best fit is a good fit. The best fit might be a bad fit. Right? So in this particular case, it seems like it worked. And we got something useful out of the data by fitting this particular hierarchical structure, but that's not always the case. And the crucial sort of lesson to learn from this stuff is that it matters what your guess is. Right? There's many different kinds of structure that you could guess as being present in your network. And it matters which one you guess. It depends on the particular network you're looking at. And some things will work better in some cases, and other things will work better in others. So there's an art as well as a science to doing this. There's math behind it. Once you've decided what your structure is, working out the best fit, that's this maximum likelihood thing. There's a way of doing that. We can do the math. But there's also an art to knowing what the appropriate kind of structure is in the first place. So now let me give you a couple of other examples. So here's a fun network. This is a network that I got from Jim Moody, who's at Duke University. And this is from a large study he did of friendship patterns amongst school kids in US schools. So this particular network here is for a school. The nodes represent the students in school, and the edges represent who's friends with whom. But now there's an interesting feature. Well, there's several interesting features about this network, but there's one particular one that I want to concentrate here on, which is that I don't know if you can see this from where you're sitting, but the edges in this network are directed edges. They have a direction. They have arrows on them, if you look carefully. And edge points from one node to another node. And you can say, well, what's up with that? Right? I mean, this is supposed to be friendship, and friendship's supposed to be, you know, a two-way street. Why is it going one way? Well, the answer is it's to do with how you gather the data, right? How do you determine who's friends with whom in a network like this? Well, you just ask people, right? You just go in and you say, so, who are you friends with? And people tell you. Person A says they're friends with person B, right? So then you draw an arrow from A to B, saying A is friends with B. So that's what the arrows represent. Now, there are cases where the arrows go both ways, like down here. A said they're friends with B, and B says they're friends with A. But a significant fraction of the time, that doesn't happen. A says they're friends with B, and then B says, oh, I've never seen A before in my life, or you know, whatever. In this particular study, they studied about 100 schools, and on average, about 50% of the time, the connection only goes one way. So 50% of them are both ways, and 50% of them are only one way. So what does this mean? How are we supposed to interpret that? The most common interpretation in the sociological literature is that this is a mistake, that this is an error in your data, that underlying this, there's the real pattern of friendships, and the edges you see are reflecting that real pattern, but they don't reflect it perfectly. There are errors in the data, and that's why sometimes you only see the edge going one way. In the work we did, we took a slightly different approach. We said, well, let's take a look at the directions of these edges, because maybe there's a signal there, right? Maybe they're actually telling us something about what's going on in the network. So again, the trick here is to make a shrewd guess about what the structure might be that they're telling you about. And we tried various different things, but the one that turns out to work is this. We guessed that what's happening here is there's some sort of rank or status dimension to this network. There are, you know, the cool kids, and there are the less cool kids, like me. And that when you look at these directed edges, it's typically going to be somebody claiming that they're friends with somebody who's sort of higher up the status dimension than they are. So you have two kinds of things going on. You have pairs that have connections both ways, like these, and you have pairs that have only connections one way. And so the claim is that if you just ignore the ones that are going both ways and look at the ones that are just going one way, so just get rid of these ones, then what you'll see is that all or most of the edges are pointing upwards from lower rank nodes to higher rank nodes. So if we just make a plot of this, we should be able to just see that all the edges are going upwards. Because the catch is, we don't know what the rank dimension is, right? All we have is the network. We don't know, you know, who's got higher status and who's got lower status in the network. So we have to work that out. Well, so one thing that you can do, a very simple thing you can do, is you can do something called a minimum violations ranking, which is just, let's take all the edges that go only one way, and then we'll try ordering them in every possible order, and we'll find the ordering that makes the maximum number of edges go up and the minimum number of edges go down. So you can do that. And like I say, there were about 100 schools, 80-something schools actually, 84 or something schools in this study. We looked at them all. We found that on average, you could get about 98% of the edges to go up and only 2% of them to go down. Plus or minus sort of 1% or something. So basically, you can get all of the edges to go up if you rank the edges, if you rank the nodes in the right way. Right? This is many more than you would expect just on the basis of chance, right, if you randomize the network. So yeah, it looks like there is a signal there. However, this is doing this works fine, but you're throwing away an awful lot of useful information because you've thrown away those edges that went both ways. And there's useful information in the edges that go both ways as well, it turns out. So we did something a bit more sophisticated. We're going to do one of these inference calculations. We're going to do one of these maximum likelihood things again. In other words, I'm going to come up with a model that generates a network, and then I'm going to use it to generate many networks and see which one is most similar to the network that I actually saw in the real world. Right? So in other words, I'm going to generate lots of different rankings of the nodes. The rankings of the nodes are playing the role of the tree in the previous hierarchical structure thing. That's the sort of underlying model that dictates what's going on here. dictates the positions of the edges. It's the ranking of the nodes. I'm going to generate many rankings, and I'm going to throw down edges according to those rankings to generate a network, and I'm going to see which network I come up with looks most like the network that I had in the real case. Okay, so the simplest kind of model we first started looking at was, let's just assume a model where the probability of connection just depends on the difference between the ranks of two nodes. Right? There's some probability that just depends on how far they are apart in rank and who's higher than who and so forth. Turns out that didn't work well. So this was one of these cases where there's just no good fit. Right? And there's a signal of that in your maximum likelihood method. There's a signal that you're not getting a good fit. You can tell that this just didn't work well. The data were curved and we were fitting a straight line. There's just no good fit for that model. And the reason for that, it turns out that you have these bidirectional edges that go both ways, and then you have the one directional edge that only goes one way. And it turns out that those basically have completely different statistics. They behave in fundamentally different ways, it turns out. So that's telling you something sociological about this network, right? There's a hint right there that there's something fundamentally different between the friendships where both people claim the friendship and the friendship where only one person claims the friendship. So it turns out we need to incorporate that difference in order to make a model that fits the data well for some values of the parameters. So we took a more complicated model where we had two different sets of probabilities, one for a one-directional edge and one for a bidirectional edge. And then we fitted that. We used something called an expectation maximization algorithm, which what it does is it separately learns what the ranking is and also what that probability function is, the probability of connection between two nodes. And actually, technically, there are now two probability functions because there's one for the one-directional edges and one for the two-directional edges. So this, for instance, is what our probability functions come out looking like. So the EM algorithm actually does two things. So one, it returns the empirical distribution, which is the histogram here, and the other, it returns a fit to that distribution, which is the model that you're using to generate the probabilities. You get both of those things out of this thing. And as you can see, they agree pretty well in this case. We fitted the empirical distribution quite well to we fitted the model distribution quite well to the empirical distribution. So in each of these plots, horizontal axis is rank difference. So in other words, the method ranks the nodes from highest to lowest. It assigns them a set of ranks, which here have been normalized to run from 0 to 1. So the highest rank is 1, the lowest rank is 0, and that means the biggest difference between one rank and another is 1 minus 0, or 0 minus 1. Right? So it can go from the lowest value is minus 1 and the highest value is plus 1. Right? So the rank difference runs from minus 1 to plus 1. And what these plots are showing is what's the probability that there's a friendship between two people based on their rank difference. The plot on the left is for the bidirectional friendships. That's where both people say they're friends. And the plot on the right is for the one-directional friendships. So on the left, what you see, sort of interesting, is just a big spike right around 0. What that's saying is that almost all of the bidirectional friendships are between people who are ranked very similarly in this ranking. Right? If two people are both going to say that they're friends, then their status is almost exactly the same in this calculation. What about the one-directional friendships where only one person says they're friends with the other person? Well, there's still a big spike at 0, so it often happens when two people have about the same rank, but there's also this sort of one-sided tail that sticks out on the right-hand side. So that's the people saying that they're friends with somebody else who's a higher rank than them. But notice the tail also sort of falls off like that. It's higher, close to the origin, and then it falls off. So it says what's happening is people are saying that they're friends with somebody who's just a little bit higher up than them. Right? They don't claim to be friends with like the coolest kid in the class. Nobody would believe them if they said that. So they claim to be friends with somebody who's just like a little bit higher up the totem pole than they are. So that's what this tail represents here. So one could ask, well, is there any truth behind this? So you can test this against other things. So there are various other things that are sort of widely believed to be measures of status in social networks. So one example would just be popularity. How many people said that they were friends with you? Right? If lots of people said they were friends with you, then apparently you're a popular person. Right? So that would be an indicator of higher status. So that's what these plots are showing. So in degree is how many people's edges were pointing to you. How many people said that they were friends with you. And what this is showing is that your rank is strongly positively correlated with your in degree. If you're more popular, then you also have higher rank. We also checked it against out degree. How many people did you say you're friends with? And there's a modest positive correlation there. It does go up, but it's a lot less of an effect. So that's saying people who are just sort of generally more sociable, who say that they're friends with lots of people, tend also to be popular. Okay? Or we compared it against total degree in plus out, which I guess is sort of some measure of total level of social activity or something like that. So those seem to back up the idea that this ranking has some correlation with independent measures of popularity, of status. Another thing that people commonly look at is just age. So especially, you know, in this age group where we're talking about teenagers, that the older you are, the higher status you have. The older kids just tend to be higher in status. And that seems also to correlate with the rank that comes out of this analysis. So if we measure average rank of all of these groups, it goes monotonically up as you go up the grades. Except, interestingly, here, between grades 8 and 9, so this was a study of junior high and high schools. And grade 8 to 9 is where you swap from junior high to high school. So when you're in grade 8, you are temporarily the oldest kid in the school. Right? So maybe that gives you a bit of a boost in status. And then you move up to high school, and now you're the youngest kid in the school. Right? So maybe 8 gets bumped up a little bit, and 9 gets bumped down a little bit. And it turns out that there's essentially no difference between 8 and 9 there. All the other differences are highly statistically significant, but there isn't any there. So again, maybe some evidence that this is, you know, extracting something real from these data. Okay, so I talked about the hierarchical structure. I talked about this ranking structure. Those are two good examples of things which seem to work in some cases, but you've got to be smart about which one you choose. You've got to be choosing a kind of structure that makes sense for the kind of network you're looking at, the kind of questions you want to answer. So the third kind of structure that I want to talk about is kind of the granddaddy of them all, namely community structure. One of the best kinds of, oh, I just want to, there's one example of one of the networks that we looked at. Right, fine. Okay, community structure is in some ways simpler than the other kinds of structure I talked about. It's just, can I divide a network into sort of clumps of nodes? Is there a clump of nodes here and a clump of nodes there and a clump of nodes here? This is a very well studied example of large-scale structure in networks. There's been a huge amount of work on this. But it turns out that not everything has been said. It turns out that this is a deep problem. And there's still interesting things we're discovering about that. And I just want to tell you in the last few minutes briefly about some new things that we've discovered about that. So typically when people study this, what they're doing is they're looking for some computer algorithm that will find communities and networks or something like that. And this problem has been done to death. But it turns out there are other questions you can ask about this that are kind of interesting. So let me tell you about that. So the basic problem here is I have some network, and for whatever reason, I believe that it divides up into some clumps like this. So my large-scale structure is that has this clumpiness in it, and I want to find these clumps. Well, as I say, there's various ways of doing that, doing the problem of finding what the clumps are in the network. But I want to talk about one particular one here that I've been involved with, so-called modularity maximization method. And I'm not talking about that because it's the best method. I want to talk about it because, for a completely different reason actually, because it turns out that that there's a nice mathematical formulation of the method. So you can come up with a computer algorithm using this method to find communities in the network. But that's actually not what I'm going to be interested in. What I'm going to be interested in is I come up with a computer algorithm, and then I'm going to analyze the computer algorithm itself And it turns out that by analyzing the algorithm, I can learn things about the network. This kind of subtle point, so I'll go through the details, explain what I mean by this. But it turns out that just using the algorithm is not always the most interesting thing to do. Sometimes actually analyzing the algorithm to see how well it performs can tell you new things that you didn't know before. So let's take a look at that. So how do I go about finding these groups? So this method of modularity maximization basically turns this into an optimization problem. So what I'm going to do is you give me a network and you give me a way of dividing it up into groups, and I'm going to give a score to that, okay, which is high if it's a good division and it's low if it's a bad division. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to look through all possible divisions to find the one that has the highest score, and that's going to be my best possible division of the network. So I've turned the problem of finding communities in networks into a problem of optimization of a benefit function over all possible divisions of a network. That's sort of the computer sciencey way of looking at it. So the question is, what should the benefit function be? I want some benefit function that gives me a high score if I have a good division of a network into groups. So if you look at a picture like this, I'd say, well, a good division of a network into groups is one where most of the edges in the network, most of the connections, fall within the groups. And only a few of them, just a small number, fall between the groups. That's the basic definition, right? So I could just count, for instance, what fraction of edges fall within groups. And you can do that, but that's not actually quite the best definition of the function because then it's clear that the optimum of that function would be, let's just put all of the nodes in one group together. If I do that, then all of the edges were in groups. They're all within this one group. So I score 100% on my benefit function, but it's totally useless. It doesn't actually give me a division of the network. Right? So that's not quite the right thing. So it turns out that what is the right thing is, let me count the number of edges within groups and subtract from it the expected number of edges if the edges were just placed at random. Right? In other words, how many more edges do I have within groups than I would expect on the basis of chance if everything was just randomized? So in order to make sense of that, I need to say, what do I mean when I randomize the positions of the edges? In other words, I have to have a null model of my network. I have some way of randomizing the edges. And there are various ways you could do that. So fundamentally, what we're going to have to do is define this quantity p sub ij, which is the probability that there is an edge between node I and node j after I do this randomness. That's going to be the quantity that defines my null model. And there's various choices of this pij. The very simplest one is I could just choose it to be uniformly random. There's an equal probability of connection between any two nodes. But it turns out that one actually doesn't work very well for technical reasons. The one that people almost always use is something called the configuration model, which says that the probability of connection is higher between two nodes that have high number of connections, high degree so-called, and lower between two nodes that have low degree. And this is sort of kind of obviously the right thing to do. If two people have lots and lots of friends, then they're more likely to know each other than two people who are complete hermits, right? I mean, that's obviously the case. It's maybe not obvious what the exact formula is, but it turns out to be just proportional to the product of the number of connections of the two nodes, the product of the two degrees. So you've got some definition for this pij. That defines your null model. And now I have this nice matrix formulation, which works like this. I define something called the adjacency matrix of the network. So I measure my network, it has n nodes. I define an n by n matrix, which has a 1 everywhere there's a node. So if there's a node between, there's an edge, sorry, there's one everywhere there's an edge. So if there's an edge between node I and node j, then the ijth element of this matrix is a 1, and all the other elements are zeros. Okay, so it's just 1, 0 matrix, and it has 1s representing where the connections are. So that's this matrix A, and then this pij, remember, is the probability in the null model of a connection between those two edges. So now I ask, what is the average, what is the actual number of edges between nodes I and j minus the expected number in the model, right? So aij is the actual number of edges, 1 if there's an edge, 0 if there isn't. And pij is the expected number of edges after you do the randomization. So aij minus pij is actual minus expected number of edges between these two nodes. And then I just want to sum that over all pairs that are in the same group. So remember, you're giving me a division of the network into groups. So I know what the groups are. I'm going to sum over all pairs that are in the same group. And I get the total number of edges within groups minus the expected number of edges within groups. So I want to sum this quantity Aij minus Pij over all pairs of vertices Ij falling in the same group. So now I'm going to define another quantity S sub I. So I'm going to do just the very simplest case here of dividing this network into two groups. I can do more than that, but let's keep it simple here. I'm going to divide it into just two groups. I'm going to divide this thing here, define this thing S sub I, which takes only two values, plus and minus 1. There's one for each vertex I, one for each node, and it's going to be plus 1 if I belongs to group 1 and minus 1 if I belongs to group 2. In other words, if you're a physicist, it's an Ising spin. It's spin up if you're in group 1, and it's spin down if you're in group 2. It's a plus 1 or a minus 1 on every node. Okay, so now I can put all of these things together and calculate this thing we call the modularity, which is the actual minus expected number of edges within groups. And I do a little bit of arithmetic, and I end up with this expression here, which says the quantity I want, this benefit function, is equal to some boring constant that I don't care about, 1 over 4m, times this quadratic form here. What's this? So S is a vector that has all those S sub i's as its elements. It's an n element vector, plus or minus 1s for each of the nodes. And B is something called the modularity matrix, which is the matrix that has elements Aij minus Pij, the thing from the previous transparency. So if you tell me a network, then I can calculate this B. Right? That just depends on the structure of the network. And this S just depends on how you break the network up into the two groups. The name of the game here now is we want to maximize this quantity Q by varying S. You give me a B, and I want to find the S that makes this thing as big as possible. And that's going to be my best division into groups. Okay, how do I do that? Well, I won't go through the details here, but it turns out that that's a computationally hard maximization to do, but you can do a good approximation to it using a spectral method. Within this approximation, it turns out that the best choice is to set the matrix S, set the vector S equal to the leading eigenvector of that matrix B, the modularity matrix. So you give me this matrix B, I calculate its leading eigenvector, the one that corresponds to the most positive eigenvalue, and that's the value S that I should choose. Well, kind of, sort of. That value S doesn't necessarily have elements that are plus or minus 1. It can have elements that have any real value. Right? So then I just take that eigenvector and I round it off to plus or minus 1. So the end result is you take that eigenvector, and the ones that are positive, you round them up to plus 1. The ones that are negative, you round them down to minus 1. So basically, you're just looking at the signs of the elements of the leading eigenvector. So the explanation is a bit complicated, but the bottom line is pretty simple. You give me a network, I can calculate this matrix, this modularity matrix. Then I look at its leading eigenvector and divide the nodes up according to the signs of the elements. And that's supposed to give me my best division of this network into two groups. And it turns out it works pretty well. Here's just a little fake network that I made. Here's the network. Here's the eigenvector elements. And you see there's a clump that's positive. This is the 0 line with the dotted line here. There's a clump that's positive, and there's a clump that's negative. And you divide along the 0 line, and you very nicely recover the two groups in the original network. Here's a nice real example. This is a sort of fun example from a study that I did a few years ago with a marine biologist called David Luceau, who's at Aberdeen. This is a social network of animals. So some animals have social networks. This particular one is a network of bottlenose dolphins. So dolphins are very sociable creatures, apparently. I mean, I've never met a dolphin, but I hear. David spent several years on boats in Doubtful Sound, New Zealand, watching dolphins. And he claims to be able to tell which dolphins are friends with which other dolphins. And he assembled, actual social networks of who's friends with whom. So this was one of the communities of dolphins that he studied during his work. And it was an interesting case, this one. Because during the time he was studying them, one of the dolphins, this one here, disappeared, the yellow triangle. It wasn't dead. We know that because it came back about 2 years later. But I don't know, it just went dolphin walkabout or something for a couple of years, just disappeared. And it turns out that that dolphin was the glue holding the dolphin community together. Because when it did, this whole group split into two separate parts that went their separate ways. The split actually happened along the lines represented by the red circles and the green squares here. That's the split that happened in real life. If you take this network and you feed it into our community detection algorithm, it says you should split it down that dashed line in the middle, which doesn't correspond perfectly to the red circles and the green squares, but it's pretty good. It's not far off. So remember, the network is measured before the split happened. So you're sort of predicting how the split was going to happen in future from data that was measured in the past here. Here's another sort of fun example that I got from Valdis Krebs again. This is a network that he did. The nodes in this network represent books. They're all books about US politics. Okay? They're all written around the time of the 2004 presidential election, which is the one between George Bush and John Kerry. And Valdis has conveniently color-coded them blue on the left and red on the right. Okay? So, for instance, we have the faith of George W. Bush over here, and we have the lies of George W. Bush over here. Right? Okay? And then what are the connections? What are the edges in this network? The edges are frequent co-purchasing on the online bookseller Amazon.com. Right? So if you go on Amazon and you look up a book, it'll say people who bought this book also bought these other books. You see that thing? Right? Yeah. Okay, so that's what it is. He just went on Amazon. He looked up every one of these books. There's about 100 of them. And he found out which ones were frequently purchased by the same people, and he filled in the lines. Okay. So the claim is that you can see the polarization of American political discourse by looking at the structure of the connections in this network. And indeed, if you feed it into the community detection algorithm, it splits into two groups that correspond very closely to the blue group and the red group that Valdis himself identified. He identified it just by looking at the blurbs on the back of the books, right? But even if you didn't know anything about politics, you didn't pay any attention to the text of the books themselves, all you knew was this network, you could work out that there were two groups here, and this is what the members of the two groups were. So you couldn't tell who was left wing and who was right wing, but you could tell which the members of the two groups were. So you can do that. Okay, so this works fine. It gives you a method for detecting the groups in the network. But as I said, that's actually not the point that I wanted to talk about here. The point that I want to talk about here is we can also learn something from analyzing the algorithm itself. Right? So I've given you an algorithm that you can apply to a network. It's take this matrix, calculate its leading eigenvector, take a look at the signs of that leading eigenvector. And that will find the groups in the network. Okay? So now, here's what we did. We want to test how well this algorithm works. So we're going to do that by setting up a sort of controlled test of the algorithm. We're going to create fake networks that have communities in them. And we know where the communities are because we put them there. And then we're going to see whether it can find those communities. So it's a bit like the test that we did with the link prediction, where we removed some edges from the network and then we tested our algorithm to see if it can find which ones we removed. Same kind of idea. Here we bury networks in the network and we say we don't tell the algorithm where they are, and we can see if we can find it. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a fairly standard test, something called the stochastic block model, which is you throw down a bunch of nodes and then you divide them into groups. That's the gray circles here. And then I have two probabilities, which I'll call P in and P out, for connections inside groups and outside groups. So for every two nodes, if they're in the same group, they get an edge with probability P in. And if they're in different groups, they get an edge with probability P out. And if I make P in bigger than P out, then I get traditional community structure here. I'm going to get more edges on average inside groups and fewer edges between groups. What's more, I can vary the values of P in and P out to make this a harder test or an easier test. If P in is way bigger than P out, it should be really obvious where the groups are. There'll be lots of connections in the groups and very few between groups. But if I make them more equal to each other, then it'll be harder to tell where the groups are. And if I make them exactly equal to each other, then the community structure disappears at all, and there's no way of telling where the communities are. Right? So we're going to use this as a test of our algorithm. So what you can imagine doing now is let me generate 1,000 networks using this thing here. And for the sake of simplicity again, let's just say we'd only do two groups. It's going to do the two-group case. And then I feed them into the algorithm and I ask, how many of the vertices did it get right? How many did it classify into the right nodes? So I could do that in principle, but the nice thing is it turns out I don't have to. Actually, I can do all of this just analytically. Right? I can tell you how well this algorithm is going to do without ever actually running the algorithm. I can do it just mathematically because it turns out that I can calculate the whole spectrum of this modularity matrix analytically for this very simple random model. So it involves doing a bunch of random matrix theory, which I won't go into here, but the end result is, here's what the eigenspectrum of this matrix looks like. It has, so it's an n by n matrix, so it has n eigenvalues, and n minus one of those eigenvalues fall in a continuous band, at least in the limit of large size, they fall in a continuous band, which takes a very classic form from random matrix theory called the Wigner spectrum, or the semicircle spectrum. And that's this bit here. And then there's one extra eigenvalue that falls outside the band over here. And I can tell you where the semicircle starts, how high it goes, where it ends, and I can tell you the value of this one extra eigenvalue out here. Now remember that when I run this algorithm, what I'm interested in is the leading eigenvector of the matrix. That's the eigenvector corresponding to the highest lying eigenvalue. So that's precisely that one over there. So I'm interested in looking at that eigenvector over there. Okay, so now the parameters here are P in and P out, these two connection probabilities that I talked about. And actually it turns out that the convenient thing is to rescale those by a factor of n the size of the system to create C in and C out. You can think of C in and C out as just being the average number of connections that a node has in its own group and the average number of connections it has outside its group. Physically, that's what those represent. And in terms of those things, I can parameterize this whole spectrum. So now take a look at this is the eigenvalue I'm interested in. That's the leading eigenvalue called Z1 here. It's given by this expression here in terms of C in, C out. So depending on how hard I make the problem, that eigenvalue moves around. Right? If I make the problem sufficiently hard, this eigenvalue is going to go down here and disappear into the continuous band, meaning I'm just going to have the semicircle. Once I have that semicircle only and nothing else, there's no evidence there that I ever had any community structure. Right? I just have the semicircle that I would get in a network that has no community structure. Right? So I would certainly expect that if I make C in equal to C out, this eigenvalue is going to disappear. So that's the point at which there's no community structure. The fun thing is that that's not actually what happens. It disappears before that. There is an earlier point where there's still structure in the network, but this eigenvalue disappears into the edge of the continuous band there. So my guess is that at that point, I'm not going to have any evidence left in my spectrum that there's communities in the network. And I can prove that, in fact, that's the case. So I can also calculate the eigenvector that corresponds to that leading eigenvalue. It looks like this. So this is numerical data for an actual network of 1,000 nodes. It had two groups in it. And what you see is one group was nodes 0 to 500. They mostly have positive eigenvector elements. And the other group was nodes 500 to 1,000. They mostly have negative eigenvector elements. So that's exactly what we expect to see. Remember, you're going to divide according to signs. You're going to put the positive ones in one group and negative ones in the other group. So if I divided this according to signs, I'd put most of these in one group and I put most of those in the other group. And that's the right answer, because that's the groups that I buried in the network to begin with. But it's not exactly the right answer, because you notice there's some noise here. Of course there is. It's a random network. So some of these eigenvector elements, they randomly deviated so much that they crossed the zero line and became negative over here. So now if I'm just blindly classifying things by what sign they have, plus or minus, these ones down here are going to get classified wrong. They're going to be put in the negative group, along with these guys over here, which is the wrong group. Remember, all of these guys are group 1, all of these guys are group 2. So a few of group 1 are just going to get wrongly classified. Okay? And a few of group 2 are also going to get wrongly classified because they cross the zero line there. Well, it turns out I can calculate how many of those ones get wrongly classified. Right? Because it turns out that I can calculate the mean and variance of the elements here exactly, and I can also show that they're Gaussianly distributed in the limit of large system size. Once I know those things, I can tell you exactly what fraction are going to cross the line on average. It's just a simple expression in terms of the Gaussian error function. Right? So I can tell you the expected error that this algorithm is going to make. And it turns out that that error goes to 100%. It gets everything wrong exactly at that point that that eigenvalue disappears into the continuous band of the spectrum. We can show that there is a phase transition at that point. What happens is, if I plot the fraction of vertices classified correctly by this algorithm, then when I make the problem easy, I get basically all of them right. I get a fraction 1 correctly classified. But as I make the problem harder, I'm making the difference between C in and C out smaller, the fraction I correctly classify gets smaller and smaller, and then there's a sudden change. That's the phase transition, where it goes to actually 0.5, right? Total failure, in this case, is represented by I classify 50% of the vertices correctly. Because if I was just tossing a coin, I would get 50% of them correct, just by luck, right? So if I'm doing no better than 50%, I'm failing totally. So there is a sharp transition at which this algorithm fails totally right here. So there's a region here between the transition and 0 where there is structure in the network, but the algorithm completely fails to find it. Actually, it's slightly more subtle than that. So what I've shown here is that this algorithm fails to find structure at this phase transition. And there's a region where there's structure in the network, but I can't find it. It's actually possible to show more than that, and this is based on work by other people, some nice results based on belief propagation analysis, which shows not only does this algorithm fail at this point, but any algorithm will fail that runs in polynomial time. There might be an algorithm that runs in non-polynomial time. If you want to exhaustively optimize modularity over the exponentially large number of possible divisions of a network, you can do that and you'll probably get a decent result. But if you have any algorithm that runs in polynomial time, including this spectral algorithm, it's going to fail at this transition point. There exists no polynomial time algorithm that will work beyond that point. So if you're a computer scientist, or if you just know about these things, then this may sound a bit familiar to you. That it sounds like the famous transition between P and NP, between polynomial algorithms and non-deterministic polynomial algorithms. And in fact, it turns out that that's exactly what this is. So we have a region here of weak structure in networks where the structure exists, and I know it exists because I put it there, but I cannot find it, or at least I cannot find it with any algorithm that runs in polynomial time. So by analyzing the actual algorithm itself, I've now learned something new about this network. I've learned that there's two different regimes of community structure in network. There's strong community structure, which is easy to find, and there's weak community structure, which is still there, but it's not easy to find unless you do an exponentially large amount of work. I'm out of time, so I had better stop there. Before I do, I just want to say thank you to my terrific collaborators on this work. Thanks to these people who gave us money. Thanks to you for your attention, and that's it. I'm done.